Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone coming in. I'm just going to give everyone just a couple seconds to get in, get settled. All right. So I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started because we got a lot of information that we want to share tonight. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Britton Ellis, and I am the Civic Librarian at Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh. Welcome to our program, Essentials of a Good Argument. This program is being recorded and will be shared with all registered attendees, as well as uploaded onto our Civic CLP playlist. As you listen to the presentation, you are encouraged to share questions in the Zoom chat box and the Q&A. You can find the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to address those questions with the time allotted at the end. We do have some community agreements that we want to go over. They are written specifically for this virtual event. So by participating today through the Q&A or in your comments, you are agreeing to keep it relevant. This discussion is focused on fundamentals of debate and learning how to explain your ideas and assess different viewpoints from school and professional settings during political discussion or through written publication. Please do your best to tailor your questions and comments to the topics at hand. Keep it kind, keep everyone in the virtual space with respect, or treat everyone in the virtual space with respect, and also keep it positive. Opinions will vary, and all opinions are valid. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Georgia Bedford. Dr. Bedford is a full-time faculty member in the Department of Communication at the University of Pittsburgh and acting associate director of the William Pitt Debating Union, also known as WPDU. As a co-curricular program, WPDU works with students, faculty, and leadership to convene public debates and perform outreach activities with students, faculty, and leadership. To convene public debates and perform outreach activities to address salient and pressing topics confronting local, regional, and national communities. The union regularly collaborates with universities throughout the Pittsburgh area to host domestic debates, as well as foreign national teams as they tour the United States. Among the international teams WPDU has entertained are the British, Japanese, New Zealand, South African, Russian, and Irish national teams, with plans to host students from Rwanda in late 2023. Dr. Bedford earned her PhD from Duquesne University with concentrations in organizational communication, interpersonal communication, and communication ethics in the public sphere, and continues her research into the interdisciplinary consequence of rhetorical studies in education. In addition to the release of a book chapter in early 2024, she has a book proposal currently under review. Ooh, welcome, Dr. Bedford.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here and share ideas. And I would again invite anyone who has anything they would like to ask as I'm going through. I'd like for this to be as conversational as possible. So don't hesitate at all to ask any questions, and Britt can certainly navigate that process as well and help me. If I don't see the question right away, she can certainly alert me to the fact that there is something on the table. So I'd like to just start by explaining the approach. We do have 3 webinars scheduled in this discussion about the essentials of a good argument. So this is a good starting point. It's the foundation of the subsequent webinar on civil discourse, the importance of civil discourse, and critical thinking and media literacy. And in teaching argument, as one of the many courses I teach, those topics are very critical. So I'll start by giving you a bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about in this session, and then also prepare you for the subsequent discussions. So you might have heard this discussion about the problem of the 21st century And so that has to do with a few things we're going to discuss: bias, truth telling, truth seeking, and things like fake news. We're going to go over definitions. Definitions are always important. You should always know the terms that you are dealing with. And if you hear something that you're not familiar with, it's important to step aside, take notes when you're reading or listening to something or watching, and make sure that you follow up so that you can understand everything that is being presented to you. And we're also going to go over some expectations for arguers in any type of a situation, whether that be public deliberation or an interpersonal setting. We're going to talk about some key elements that should be in place to have an effective argument. And we're also going to talk about goals of argument, whether we seek common ground or we look for new ground. So it's very important to be able to first analyze arguments before you can expect to become a good arguer yourself. So one of the things that we want to start with is to talk a little bit about the difference between the goals and settings for public deliberation and how that happens, and then how communication happens or even spills over into relational aspects of communication. And I looks like I have a chat here, so I just want to check that very quickly. Okay. So the obvious difference between public deliberation and the relational context in which communication happens is that in public deliberation forums, you should have the opportunity to participate in any discussion. There should not be any restrictions based upon, title, status, expertise, wealth, or any other such factors that would serve to mediate between you and fellow participants or the topics themselves. So the idea for that type of a setting is that it should be egalitarian, it should be dynamic, and everyone should have an active voice. This has become more complex, however, with the expansion of social media as a forum, because public issues are often conflated with things such as values that relate on a personal or relational level. And so you oftentimes hear values-based arguments as though they are evidence-based. And so there's a conflation between the two of those things. So in learning how to evaluate arguments, you can learn to distinguish between when you're dealing with something that's values-based versus true evidence. And we're also going to examine what argument itself actually is, because there are some misconceptions about what an argument looks like and what it feels like to be in an argument. So whether you're in a public deliberation setting, whatever that forum looks like, or if you are in an interpersonal, relational type of communicative event, the tenets of argumentation apply across the board. So one of the first things we want to look at are some terms, and firstly, just setting out to explain what is this problem that we are seeing in the 21st century? Why is that term showing up and popping up so much? Well, first of all, this is not new to the 21st century. Certainly, the issues that we're dealing with, the forums that we have access to, and the ways that we communicate about things shift and change just as we progress through time. And so we see, perhaps things being a little bit more contentious than we have seen in previous years, but it certainly would not be the first time historically that we're seeing the level of civil unrest and discontent that is arising and expanding, in part because of the fact that we now have social media. So we have this distrust, and we need to know where that distrust is coming from. We distrust evidence, and we distrust the people giving evidence. And we also hear this term coming about called post-truth. So what exactly is post-truth? Well, first of all, it's very difficult to establish what truth is. And it does shift and change as society evolves we establish different interpretations of things. Even the Constitution is considered to be a living document, because as we move through time and we, develop an awareness and expand our thinking and perceptions, those changes take place. And so we can expect to hear truth spoken about within that context. I'm not talking about a relativistic kind of, whatever you feel is the right answer at a right time, kind of this valueless relativism where everything is equally good. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about truth as a responsibility for determining the best answer or solution to something as it presents itself in any given moment. And so there may be specific circumstances that affect the community at large, meaning the United States, or even a local community. And those things evolve over time, and what truth is being presented will sort of, align with those moments. So there is a historical aspect to it, but there are also different views that we're coming in, a lot of wrestling with some issues right now. And I think it's been an interesting time for sure. So it makes figuring out what's happening and, exactly how we deal with it and evaluate this information very difficult. So the term post-truth, though, we need to take a look at that. And while we're at it, fake news and bias as terms as well. So let's define that. So what does the philosophy of post-truth say? So Yale Brahms wrote an entry in the 2016 Oxford Dictionary, and he said that post-truth is defined as a term relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. We're going to talk a lot about emotion and the fact that we do need emotion, but we need to learn how to deal with that emotion, because emotion is considered to be an important aspect of argument. The problem is, though, that post-truth has gone from being this kind of peripheral term into being a mainstay, particularly in political commentary. And we're now seeing major news outlets and publications lacking in the need to clarify or define their headlines. And so you see a lot of sensationalism, you see a lot of statements that are being made and unsubstantiated. And so that also brings in this term fake news. So Vasu et al. Stated that fake news is something that can be interpreted sort of as a denial of truth or a direct intent to engage in disinformation, misinformation, or outright falsehoods. And this stuff is something that we are dealing with quite directly. Now, we've heard those terms since 2016 being, thrown around, and it's typically, if you think about the political continuum, and if you imagine that line following all the way from progressive to Democratic/liberal to centrist to Republican/conservative to libertarian, you can have fake news that comes forward from any location and all of the gradations between those delineations. So ideologically, fake news can originate from any place. And so it's not just a liberal bias, it's not a conservative bias, it can be anything. So that's the first thing that you have to kind of take away from this, that, when you're dealing with things like, claims being made about who's telling the truth and who's not telling the truth, you have to be able to acquire the skills that allow you to decipher the truth. Don't rely on what someone else tells you to believe whether it's the truth. So neither of those concepts are new phenomenon, as I said before, but the confusion that we're feeling, particularly in the public sphere, makes it very difficult to sort through what is fact versus fiction. And it does feel especially confusing now. And I mentioned social media before, and I'll just say that as a result of, and I talk to my argument students about this all the time, as a result of having various platforms wherein we can, communicate, and we see this public deliberation taking shape, There's this thing called algorithms, and I'm not sure if you are aware of what that looks like or what that means. But when you engage in certain viewing or reading habits online, that is traced and tracked. Your movements, everything that you do is tracked. Google is a big one. Facebook, even if you've never had a Facebook account. And as you continue to engage in those same behaviors, looking up the same types of topics, and particularly through a certain bias, you will start to see through algorithms your trace history being narrowed more and more and more. And so you begin to sort of move about in a silo where you have one voice, and it becomes an echo chamber where there's no disagreement, there's no difference. And so this is part of what is happening in our inability to navigate information that's facing us, that we're constantly being bombarded with in the political sphere, the public sphere, which is highly politicized. So, we talk about, the fact that we have these perceptions of what argument looks like and how debates take shape. And I'll clarify in a minute exactly what true argument is by first looking at what is not argument. But I want to clarify something further that Brahms said in citing the very brilliant Hannah Arendt, who wrote an article back in 1967, and it was called Truth in Politics. And she stated that truthfulness and honesty have never been counted among the virtues of a politician. And I don't think anybody would be surprised that something like that would be said. And she goes on to say that lies have always been regarded as necessary and justifiable tools of politicians and statesmen. And the problem with this is that Brahms believes that we have actually cultivated a greater hostility toward factual truth if it goes against a political or particular political standpoint. And so Arendt further said that in regard to that, the greatest antagonist of factual truth is an opinion. So rather than a lie, particularly in light of the current, predilection and blurring between what is fact and what is opinion, because there's a stark difference between those things. There's this deliberation that's taking place in building up and creating this kind of lying culture. And so when someone conceals behind that falsehood, and there are times when it's very obvious that that's happening, it's often couched or framed within the context of opinion. And so democracy and the freedoms that are afforded, under the constitutional right of freedom of expression kind of provides this excuse for justifying these lies as opinions. And we've kind of developed this tolerance and almost an acceptance for that, to the point where we just take it for granted. This is the way it is. And so, factual truth, as Arendt went on to say, is never completely free of interpretation or personal perspective. But this situation cannot serve as an argument against the existence of reality and facts, nor can it justify blurring the lines, dividing what is fact and what is fiction. So we need to be able to make decisions about how far are we going to go in this acceptance. So let me just check chat very quickly, because we have a question here. What book recommendations I would give to help understand the fundamentals? What reading do I recommend for my debate students? We read a lot of journal articles. We read a lot of books. The Carnegie Library does have a page of recommendations, recommended books. I did review that list, and there are some excellent books there. And I will probably submit, and Britton just provided the link to that. Those are some excellent reads. Now, there are some on there that I would consider to be more scholarly. They're a little bit more weighty and difficult to understand than some of the lower, more public-friendly texts, but that should not scare you away from trying those out. And the other question is there a difference between fake news and propaganda? I think there is a difference because propaganda is often founded upon something that is truthful, but it's either magnified or something is, taken out of context, or something is heavily promoted in a way that is highly biased. Fake news is just simply not true. So oftentimes propaganda does have an element of truth to it, but it's a harder dig to figure out exactly what it is. And I will provide that quote for that citation for Brahms. That comes from an article, and I'll have to track that down. My life's bread and my students, it's all about reading journal articles, and journal articles are hosted through the databases the library pays for, so they can be very expensive. And so but I will find those for you, and we will be sending out information with subsequent questions on that. So, where does all of this leave us? And what do we do when we are surrounded, not knowing what to take in as truth and what to discount as being either fake or misleading? Because you have all of those things. So first of all, let's talk about what an argument is not. An argument is not the pro-con form you see in debate formats. And I would actually say that presidential elections are the last place to see what a good debate is. And oftentimes on mainstream media, you have this kind of pro-con stance set up. First of all, that's not a reflection of the real world. We are not pro-con as human beings. We live in the gray. We experience the world oftentimes without a clear answer to things. So nothing is pro-con very neatly. Certainly we do have some things that come to us, and that those are oftentimes associated with our values. But in reality, it's very difficult if you consider all of the voices and all of the perspectives involved in any given issue. It would be very difficult to reduce everything down and remove all of that complexity to two sides of anything. The second thing is that arguments should be made in good faith, or they are fallacious. So we talk about logical fallacies, and I talk to my students all the time about this. Things like ad hominem. When you see people attacking each other, it is never appropriate to attack a person. It is appropriate to attack and evaluate a person's credentials, which means you're questioning their expertise. What is your experience? What is your background? What is your educational level? Do you have the credentials to speak on this? And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But they are also problematic because they oftentimes have such a strong psychological appeal that they rely mostly on emotions. And as I said, we'll talk about emotions later because we are creatures of emotion, but we have to learn how to deal appropriately with them. And so some of the pseudo arguments that you see are designed to make you think that things are more simple than they are, and they're oftentimes politicized. So we talked about that political continuum. We are not political creatures. We have a political system that we use to make certain decisions that are supposed to benefit everybody when we engage in public deliberation, and certainly more formal forums and hearings, such as congressional hearings where formal arguments are presented, in the courts, so forth. So we have a lot of different ways that happens, but and things have to be decided. And oftentimes there is a lot of emotion surrounding those things because they are politicized. So that becomes extremely confusing. So that's one thing that we have to, those are a couple of things actually that we have to pay attention to. The other thing that we have to be thinking about are two things: stakeholders and participants. So a stakeholder is someone who has an interest in the issue because there's an outcome that they are desiring, or they're going to be directly impacted by it. They might be a participant in the discussion, even indirectly. So oftentimes policy decisions are made, and then they may indirectly affect someone many, phases down the line, and it can be very difficult, but we always want to establish things like, this happened because, and that can be the tougher part of it. So you might be a participant in something and it might affect you, but establishing just exactly what happened might be difficult, because the shadow part is who's benefiting from this, things like who's paying for studies, who is behind, sponsorships for news outlets, things like that. So it's not always clear. So those are things to always bear in mind, because when there's an interest in it, that does not necessarily mean that you're going to be getting a truthful account of what's actually taking place. So stakeholders and participants, you may be a direct stakeholder because something may impact you, but you might not have any financial gain. So those are some important distinctions to make as well. So in terms of what an argument is, let's just get down to the really tough conversation about how hard it really is to evaluate arguments, how hard it really is to distinguish fact from opinion. So Kahn and Murphy, they are a couple of scholars who wrote a couple of the founding documents for the WPDU, our debating union. And what they said is that, they compiled these series of talks about debating and the foundation of debate being in argument. And they said that argument, we should remember, is a word meaning evidence or proof. So to argue means to demonstrate the truth or falsify something, to produce evidence without a particular point under discussion. And it's precisely in its power to persuade, where like all good things, it is liable to abuse. So that means that an arguer can come from a place of ethics or a good, as ancient rhetoricians, and being a rhetorician myself, I obviously have a favor toward, or a bias toward, but that is because of the potential that rhetoric has for revealing truth if it is an ethical pursuit. And so fallacious arguments are made, and remember we said arguments are fallacious when they are not designed to pursue truth, but sometimes they're made out of ignorance or to appeal to ignorance, which means they are typically lacking in evidence. They misdirect, they misrepresent, or they just out and out make false claims of some kind. So when people make statements, you need to be able to ask them to justify those statements. So whether you're in an interpersonal conflict or, but most importantly, when you are participating in some type of public deliberation in a forum, and I'll keep saying social media is a big part of this problem, you need to push people to justify their claims about things. They need to have sound reasons why they are saying what they're saying, and evidence to substantiate those things. And they need to be able to provide those accounts as to where they're getting that evidence so that you can go back and check. And I do have a list of references at the end of this, but it happened that I added some on, so I will provide those that are missing from the end because I'm aware that they are. And I'll actually provide the document from Kahn and Murphy from the 1929 publication that I'm citing, because I don't think that you'll be able to find that anywhere, but in my university library of WPDU documents, I do have that, so I will provide that. So when we use the word evidence, we are referring to any number of things. People often think about facts or statistics, but we also find evidence in anecdotal accounts, through testimony, through stories, but we have to be able to verify the credibility of those things. And so when you're listening to a news broadcast, or something is you're reading something in social media, or Uncle Jimmy posted something and he's citing some quote unquote fact from someplace, those are the opportunities that you have to push back and say, where is the evidence? And so that's foundational to good argumentation. So when somebody is giving testimony, you also need to be able to verify their credentials and say, what is your experience in this? Or do you have an educational background? And you can even do this in interpersonal encounters with people. Now, I'm not saying that you should take people to task and do this kind of listing of, you said this, and I need to list all of these examples as to why this was hurtful or why you shouldn't have said this. I'm talking about being thoughtful and really taking into account what is being said. And if you are going to make a particular claim or an accusation, to be able to provide a sound example as to why you have come to having that perception. Now, it's important to frame it as a perception in an interpersonal context because we all perceive things. We're perceiving creatures. We're constantly absorbing things all the time. And so our perception of something can be false, or we can misunderstand something that has taken place. So part of arguing is to clarify. Clarification is extremely important. We can also think of the many times that visuals provide evidence. Visuals are also arguments. So when you're seeing billboards, signs that have some keywords, they might have images, you see the use of color, space, white space, lack of words and just images. Those are all arguments, and they're using images as evidence. And so when you see something, you can't just take in what you have seen and assume that it is a truthful account or a truthful argument. Those are also times to question and scrutinize things, because sometimes visuals can be misleading because they are presented in a manner that is designed to be biased. So the other thing is we need to have the information before us. So when you're looking at a newspaper article, for example, or some type of a publication, and they don't cite any sources, that's a problem. And you need to reject that information unless they mention something that isn't necessarily cited later. And you need to be able to go and look that up. So I would be very suspicious of anything that doesn't have, when people don't use citations, when they don't cite information or the source from which they obtained it. The other thing that I would say is that Marshall McLuhan, and he has a number of books. There's one called Understanding Media, and he actually has a couple on understanding media. And he has a number of publications out there. He was a major scholar in the field of communication. He said the medium is the message. We have to be able to determine whether the argument is fitting for the platform or the channel. And I'm going to explain why that's relevant. Now, I will just say, as a disclaimer, I'm an independent, and so I scrutinize all political affiliations equally. But I will just use the example of Twitter. And this is when I talk to my students an argument about. Twitter started off, I think, with 80 characters, and then it went to 140. And then after that, around 2017, it expanded even more to, I think it was over to, we're having some audio issues. Definitely let us know if you continue to have a problem. I'm not able to hear anyone else but myself, so I don't know. But one thing that happened during that period, this was during President Trump's term, and he began using Twitter to share information on policy and make certain claims. And the problem is that it's not the proper medium for sharing policy ideas. If you are in policy analysis and you write policy papers, they can be hundreds of pages long sometimes, and they oftentimes reference studies and other articles by scholars and so forth. And so that medium becomes the message because Twitter is not the appropriate forum. There's only one thing that you can take away from that, and it's what's being said. And if it's being said in a way that's not civil, it can also lend to that problem. And President Trump was not the first person to do that, to use a medium that is not really designed for the type of message, and he certainly will not be the last one to do it. So that's not a politicized message. It's to say that we need to be careful about where we're getting information. And unfortunately, a lot of people use social media and Facebook to get information. So we also need to question things like the authority of the source. So Aristotle actually said, each man judges correctly those matters with which he is acquainted. It is of these that he is a competent critic. To criticize a particular subject, therefore, a man must have been trained in that subject. To be a good critical critic generally meant to say, he must have had an all-around education, which includes life experience. So if you see somebody that is talking about something and they have little to no experience, they should be able to tell you what their experience is. You should be able to ask that, and they should have an answer readily prepared. We have some people that are sitting in media who are news pundits that don't actually have a journalism background. And we'll talk more about journalism principles when we talk about media literacy. But you also find that emotions are used to deflect and inflame people when there are other areas lacking, such as having good evidence or authority to speak on something. So I'd like to just go on to product though, because product and process are really important. Argumentative products are those contributions that people are making, the statements that they're making in any type of an exchange. And there should be ideally a back and forth exchange where people are sharing and they have the opportunity to be heard. And that's the ideological foundation of public deliberation, so that it is egalitarian and everybody can be heard, everybody can be represented. But unfortunately, most forums do tend to be overtaken by bias. And so having the ability to spot bias when you see it in those products is really important. In argument, we call that angle of vision. So when somebody is expressing a particular angle of vision, it might be because the platform where they are sharing that information kind of invites that type of bias, or it might be that that's just the job that they have. So one of the keys for that, though, overcoming these types of things and being able to push back against that, is to treat even people you disagree with respect and compassion. And so we talk about these classical patterns of argument in debate and in argumentation classes. And one thing that becomes a problem when you're dealing with different products people are producing in arguments is that sometimes people are disrespectful in the products that they're contributing. So they're disrespectful of persons, they're disrespectful of the issues that are on hand. And sometimes they just very boldly go out there and make claims, even knowing that a subject matter might be hurtful or sensitive. There's a term that we use to describe a certain type of argument called delayed thesis, where sometimes you have to sit back with the products you want to contribute because they may seem to be not compassionate or judgmental. And all that says is, I'm going to hold on to what it is I really want to say. And I'm going to wait to hear what others have to say. I'm going to hear them out with compassion and empathy to the degree that I can without needing to overtake that person's contribution. And so there's often conflict that arises when you are at odds for people because of that fact that you are not compassionately listening, or those products that people are contributing are, very inflammatory. And so those are that's a way to kind of get around that. And even if you see something that is becoming contentious and those products are either engaging in those fallacies, such as attacking people or misrepresenting the truth, that you would have the ability to be civil yourself. So some of it is making a decision about the way you are going to contribute and participate. And sometimes the magical thing that can happen is that it tames others in a crowd. When you start displaying a lack of hostility and a lack of willingness to participate that way, so that the exchange, that back and forth exchange, remains respectful. And there are some strategies that we'll talk about as well. And we all have difficult people in our lives and times when it can be hard, but some of good argumentation is just making good decisions about the way you are going to communicate. Process is another thing. Now, Julia Wood is a very recognized interpersonal scholar, and I do have the reference at the end of this presentation, the book where I obtained this particular quote, but I do have a lot of her other books here. And if you do want to read her work, she's very accessible, but she really stresses and emphasizes listening in dialogue. And she talks about the fact that dialogue in the process of argumentation, because argument is all of these three things and they all build upon each other. So as those products are being contributed, it's a part of the larger process. We have to be open to new ways of understanding even ourselves. So the beauty of the process of dialogue is that it can open us up if we view it not as this fixed kind of response, because we're only listening to have a response. So you contributed that product just now, and I don't like what you said. And so I focus on that and I get stuck on that, rather than compassionately listening to that and being open. And we're going to talk about that openness in a minute, but in the process of dialogue, we can be realized in ourselves. So she said, because points of view and relationships in ourselves in those times and events, they're not static. So rather, they're fluid. They're processes that allow us to be continuously open, so that we ourselves can be reformed largely through these interactions we can have with people we disagree with. And that can be the hardest thing, when you absolutely disagree with somebody, but you force yourself to listen. So she says, instead of viewing discourse within this process of being preformed and pre-existing, like this version of beliefs that we have and these values that we're sticking to, that are framed according to the self we currently know and understand, that if we have this kind of openness, that we can change through that process and even come into kind of a new awareness, and maybe thinking in ways that we didn't think were possible for us before. And so this is kind of a self-disclosure that we give ourselves the opportunity to participate in. And she says it's kind of a co-authoring of a new self or an improved self based upon new understandings. And so that's an opportunity that is possible if you let the process unfold. So it's coming into being as a part of the process of conversation with the other person. And that takes time. And, not all arguments can be resolved immediately or even within a few passes. Things sometimes have to unfold organically, and sometimes it's in that process and in providing and contributing those products, you do have to hold back parts of what you want to say and things that you're thinking, so that you can allow yourself to hear what others are saying and hear what their contributions are. So what do we need for this kind of genuine argumentation to take place? Well, the first thing we need is reasonable persons, reasonable parties who are a part of this process and who are contributing products, which includes sound statements and evidence. So the process of argumentation relies heavily upon our ability as interlocutors to participate and commit to that type of dialogue. And a reasonable person is one who has made the decision, because it is a decision, to actively listen. And there's an exercise that I take my students through. And this is how we analyze. We do a rhetorical analysis on journal articles, and they can be 25, 30 pages long, and they get really good at it. But you have to read things a few times. You have to listen to something over and over again. Maybe it's a podcast, so that the first time you listen to it or read it to believe it. So you're not questioning anything the person is saying. And you're not, doubting anything that the person is saying. You're just listening. The next time you pass through, you might begin to ask questions. And, maybe something that you need clarification on, maybe you need more evidence of something. And so these are opportunities that you have to engage in the act and the decision of being a reasonable person, because ultimately, to be a reasonable person, you have to be open to changing, even when you don't think it's a possibility for you. So if you're not open to changing, why get into the dialogue in the first place, in other words? So we talk about ethos because, ancient rhetoricians and particularly Aristotle wrote a lot about this, and Plato too. Ethos resides in the character of the person. So the decisions that we make come out of our decision to either act ethically or unethically in a particular encounter. We all have agency, we all can make decisions, and we have to make those decisions out of our desire to be trustworthy and honest. And if somebody isn't, then they're lacking integrity. So I'm just going to check the chat really quickly because we have something here. Are there reasons to engage in dialogue and debate other than to change the viewpoint of others in a post-truth environment when so many are seemingly entrenched in their ideology and unwilling to entertain evidence that doesn't support their beliefs? Is there a point in engaging with them? Absolutely. We're going to talk about common ground, and when it's possible to establish common ground, and when we need to establish new ground. But sometimes that neither of those things can be your goal, and we'll talk about that as well. So we're not out to necessarily change anybody's point of view, and I don't mean to represent it that way. What we're trying to say is that we're trying to understand better where someone is coming from. We might not change what we believe at all. It might not even be a possibility. And I'm not, I don't think it's possible to easily change yourself, and even change in yourself takes time. But, and I'll cite Julia Wood again in saying that if you're going to enter into a dialogue with another person, you at least have to be willing to listen. And so that means that you have to, at least in some part, be open to that change, if it is a possibility at all. And so she also says that it's central to the idea of dialogue that, any utterance or act is always responding to and anticipating other utterances and acts. But it's important that we not make our mind up as those things are occurring, and that we do allow for the unfolding of things to happen. So that means that we have to be able to engage in logic and reason. So let's talk about logic really quickly here, because I don't want you to be turned off by that or threatened by it. It's a term that often applies to formal logic. We're not talking about formal logic. We're talking about logic that applies when we are in real world arguments, the stuff that we deal with every single day. Chaim Perlman, and I'm going to mispronounce these names very badly, so forgive me, and L. Obrecht-Taitika. They actually are scholars that are very formulative, and it is actually the book I have right here, The New Rhetoric, and this is a text that builds largely upon the work of Aristotle, and it's a treatise on argumentation. And this was written some time ago. Actually, the original, it was reprinted. It was written in 1969 and then reprinted several times. And so this is a very weighty book, and it is a book that I continue to go through. It's got 566 pages, along with all of the other books on argument. But they talk about this idea of what formal logic is. And they say that logic has been limited to formal logic. And what we're talking about with formal logic is the study of the methods of proof, that it was developed for the mathematical sciences. And so when something does not fall into this form of logic, we tend to discount it because we don't see it as having the ability to engage in reason. So when we're dealing with real world arguments, though, we need to look at other definitions, and they do go on to talk about real world logic. But as I said, this is a very weighty text. So a friendlier interpretation of real world logic comes from William Kilgore, and he says that logic on a day-to-day basis is the study of how we make and analyze arguments. And it provides us with tools to help us distinguish between good arguments and poor arguments. And it also can help us determine which arguments are correct or incorrect. But I will say, particularly in debate, our focus is not telling you you're wrong. I'm right and you're wrong. That's not our focus. We're trying to understand and teach the public how to engage in sound argumentation. So there are more times than not where we don't even present a resolution that gives any type of a solution, because we're trying to teach people how to go through the process itself and how to contribute those products that lead to meaningful conversation. So this is a form of reason. And, unfortunately, the primary models that we have for evaluating discourse, especially in conflict, they tend to lead us down the path of thinking that those are the only possibilities. I'm right and you're wrong. But it's far more than that. And if we want to live in a world where we can collaborate and develop solutions that help everyone, we need to have a different framework for evaluating things so that we don't feel like it's either or, it's, this or that, because that's not representative of what actually happens. More often than not, we end up needing to find ways to reach a consensus. And so, a couple of other definitions, just so that you know. Marcin Lewinsky, he is a scholar who is emerging in the field of how to examine multiple voices involved in what we consider to be back and forth two-person conversations, because those are the models that we have. And he talks about the difficulty of that, because we need to stop reinforcing this idea that, we can only resolve conflict by this way or that way. So, but he does say that argumentation is the key. It's a definitional quality of deliberation and our ability to do that. So what we need to do is just find a way where we can become more inclusive of multiple voices. And that's hard. It really is hard, but it's critical to a functioning society. And it doesn't matter if you go from, Aristotle to Habermas, who wrote the, structural transformation of the public sphere, which is on that list. It is a weightier reading. But if we look at it as collective deliberation, it's a multi-participant activity. So we have to start thinking differently about how we develop solutions. So in summary, we're talking about evidence, we're talking about products, we're talking about the process, but we can't leave out the discussion about the expression of values, because there's a framework that I use in argumentation. It's called the Toulmin courtroom model of argumentation. And in that model, one of the theories, and this is very much ancient rhetorical, and I'm talking all the way back to 500 BC, where it is important to establish what values are being expressed, or upon what values arguments are being founded. Values and beliefs form our assumptions, and we need to be able to convey what those values are so that we can figure out, do we share values? Are we in conflict over values? And can we figure out how to work through those complications? And so the thing about emotions and values is that they're absolutely connected. But we can't act on emotion, because acting on emotion can be reactionary, but we have to get into the mindset that we have different choices. So Gerald Hauser is another scholar who, he's in the communication field. He used to be with Penn State. I'm not sure where he is right now, but he's written a lot of books on rhetoric, and he talks about the challenges of when raters use emotions to whip up an audience into some type of emotional frenzy. And so that we're led into making emotion-based decisions. But those types of decisions aren't in our best interest. They're not an advantage. So, in truth, what he says is that we have to learn how to separate reason from the passions. And ancient scholars wrote a lot about the passions, and all they're talking about is the emotions: anger, resentment, hostility, love, hate, all of the emotions that can be kind of primitive to the human experience. And we can default to kind of, base impulses and responses because we're acting out of emotion. And so we need to move beyond that primitive state to, thinking about, okay, how can I understand the emotion? Because I can't get rid of it. And how can I maybe take the anger that I'm feeling in this particular situation where this issue really is a hot button thing for me? But I need to, and this is a term that we also use sometimes, to bracket that and kind of put it aside and just get into that hearing mode. And this is harder. I don't mean to make it sound as though this is an easy journey. Hauser went on to say that, psychologists, he talks about the studies that they've done on emotions because they're trying to locate them, define what they are, and they want to use them to ultimately build some type of a framework that would lend to a scientific theory of human behavior. So unfortunately, it's an ongoing process because our psychological responses are sometimes so our emotions so embody our psychology that it can be very difficult to extract that. So what the findings illustrate is that even though we can name feelings and describe them, this does not mean that they are discrete entities within us. They aren't. They are patterns. They're patterns of responses, and they can be conditioned by many different factors, and they are connected to our thoughts and our language. And so that's why I said the values that we believe, we express those in words and language. Those become the products of our conversations and the discourse that we engage in. And in that process, we can allow those values to represent what should be evidence. And John Watson, he also cites, who was a behaviorist, and he actually goes so far as to say that thinking is a subvocal talking. And so we can do that without even reflecting upon that because it's just so natural to have an emotive response to something. But this is not to say that emotions are evil. Like I said, we need emotion. If we don't feel anything, we're never going to get upset if we see a story that's tragic or horrific. But we need to learn how to express our emotions and the values that emanate from those emotions and emotional responses in a way that is more productive and collaborative. And the final thing that I'll say is that about the need for a genuine argument, it might sound absolutely counterintuitive, but you need tension. And unfortunately, people are really afraid of conflict. And conflict does not have to be an ugly thing. In fact, it is absolutely essential. You should be in some of my meetings with my debate teams. We have a lot of conflict because we're trying to navigate through different perceptions, different viewpoints, and we're not coming from it from our perspective. We're citing the articles and the studies that we're seeing. And so we're representing the many perspectives that are out there. So that naturally leads to conflict. But Julia Wood, again, says that inherent to dialogue, I mean, it's absolutely integral, is tension. You need it. So she says tension between the perspective one holds at a given moment and the perspective of an others is something that can actually create possibilities, as I alluded to before, to expand your own awareness and create a different version of yourself. Because don't we all want to be more understanding, less stressed, less anxious? And sometimes that requires that we kind of learn and make decisions about what do I need to let go of? this is a tension that's coming about, and I'm engaging in this tense dialogue with people because we're butting heads over things that we could collaborate to find, maybe a consensus where we're giving a little, getting a little, but the tension itself has to be there for us to do that. So we shouldn't fear that part of it. But we do have to be aware, as I said, that we can't let what drives us as human beings, such as our values and beliefs and assumptions, overwrite those of everybody else. So, in other words, you have to get to the point where some of those things are not going to be able to exist or coexist with others in the world. And so, not to say that you have to change who you are, what you believe. That's not what I'm saying at all. But what I am saying is that you have to allow the tension to bring something of yourself forward, a different part of you that maybe can, and we don't like the word tolerate. We don't like the words, consider, or, taking into account what somebody else, because that means that we have to step back in some ways. But does our ego really need that? So this is the other part, though, where establishing common ground can lead us to a different place, because Wood also talks about the difference between sticking to common ground, which is an evolution of those values and beliefs that you might hold right now, or do we need to establish some new ground? So common ground can be the starting point, and it can be a place where we do initially resolve some differences. But if we miss out on the opportunity to allow those differences to exist, and not try to resolve the differences themselves, not try to overcome them, not try to synthesize them, or otherwise tame them, we can agree to disagree. That's another option. And so that's why I said before that you don't have to try to change anybody's mind, but why can't you live in a world where somebody just disagrees with you? Conflict and contradiction can teach us things. They can, bring forward this, what she calls this elusive goal of unity, because that shouldn't be as important as the process of learning to listen and understand where someone is coming from. So unity is not necessarily always a possibility. So we can't get stuck in this idea that, well, we have to establish common ground, and that's the only way that we can move forward, because that is not the only way. We can simply live in a world of difference and evolve as a result of that, and look at the new opportunities that those different insights bring about. I mean, we would not have the evolution of technology and progress that we experience and enjoy in our world if everybody thought the same, if everybody had the same viewpoints, if everybody had the same values and beliefs. Because some people have to be fearless, and some people can't worry about what anybody says or does, and they just have to get out there and engage in the doing, which is a term that we also use. So sometimes it's not always possible to change our stance, but the process itself is still important, because we have this opportunity to find new ground where maybe we do have disagreement, but we can forge something new. We can engage differently socially in our world on the basis of what is new and different, even as we exist within ourselves. So in other words, we don't have to be threatened just because somebody is different or somebody disagrees. And so when we get into civil discourse, and when we talk about media literacy, we're going to talk about the ways in which we are taught to believe that those are the only possibilities, and the reasons why those things are contributing to the dissatisfaction that we're having, and the problems that we're having communicating with one another. So I'm going to check chat really quickly just to see if we have any further questions, but I don't want to overtake you with too much more. The other thing that I do want to just provide are some opportunities to, have some, there's actually another book written by Susan Cain, And she has a TED talk out there, and it's called Quiet the Power, Quiet the Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. And I want to mention this because introverts often suffer under the voice of the dominant ones in a conversation. So you can find yourself being left out and feeling like your voice is not being heard and feeling that you're dominated in situations like that. But the interesting thing is that studies find that introverts actually have a lot of really great ideas. So I just wanted to mention that book to you because she says that we're not always getting the best ideas from the best talkers. So I'm going to talk to you about 4 principles of collaboration. So the first one is just validation and reflection. Validation doesn't mean agreement. It just means you validate that you've heard the other person. You're reflecting on what they've said. You've heard them, and at even any given point, either one of you can occupy this ground in a dialogue, and whatever the argument is. And so what you have to do is listen in a non-judgmental manner so that that person feels that you're listening to them and you're not judging everything or latching onto something that you heard 10 minutes ago and preparing an answer for that. So, and you're not judging what they say. You're not saying, I disagree with you, or I don't like that, or anything of that nature. Each person has to feel that they're being heard and that you're listening to them. Because we all come from different places. We all have a different frame of reference. And so we're not meant to be, carbon copies of one another. And we're not meant to put ourselves in, these shapes where we don't fit. So don't force other people to do that. That's where that's coming from. So there's kind of this compassionate listening, or Carl Rogers was a psychologist I mentioned before. I think he did the bulk of his work back in the 50s, but he talked about empathic listening. And he's actually behind that model I mentioned previously about delaying your thesis, your claims, your statements that you want to get out there until you have allowed that process organically to unfold. Because we want to move, away from this learning stance that's one directional, because a lot of the early communication models were message coming from me to you, you've heard me, and that's it. They have to be dynamic. They have to be, a process where, sometimes things you do have points where you stop and clarify, but that's not judgment. Clarification is different. You're just reiterating, maybe, there are a couple of exercises, and this comes from intercultural scholarship. And I'll find, if you want more information on this, but a lot of Native American cultures use this, and some countries throughout Africa use it. But the possessor of the object, you might have heard of the conch shell. If you're in a particularly contentious situation and you're not getting anywhere, and you keep over talking and having a difficult time of understanding each other, whoever is the possessor of the object you designate is the only person that gets to talk until they finish their point, and then they can pass it on to somebody else. And then that person speaks, and this is where that back and forth can happen if it's something that's really, a hot button topic. The other thing is the say back exercise, which I said is a means by which you can clarify and reflect upon what someone said, so that you can not only convey to them that you're interested in understanding, but actually seek to understand yourself. So this really summarizes where we're going, because we're trying to, I think it's more of an attitudinal shift that we're trying to move into to have good arguments. But we also do need to push back when we know that people are not justifying the things that they're saying, that they are not providing the evidence that we need to evaluate the information. So whether it's in formal arguments, informal, whether it's public deliberation in social media forums or wherever that's taking place, or interpersonal, all of these principles are really about negotiation and mutual openness to listening, understanding, and maybe changing, but sometimes just agreeing that we can disagree and coexist with other people. So that concludes the presentation I have, and I'm certainly open to any questions that you have. Britton, do you have anything for me?
Let me see. Looks like
Let's take a sip of water here.
we do have some feedback from Val. She said, thanks for defining terms as you go along.
I know I breezed through an awful lot of information. So feel free, if you're going to participate in the next session, even to carry over some questions. If something comes to you, or if you want to submit anything to Britton later, feel free to do that as well.
As we give folks a couple minutes to maybe put in any last minute questions that they can have, I do want to put into the chat. We will be back. Dr. Bedford will be back on March 20th and then also March 27th. The 20th, we're talking about the importance of civil discourse, and the 27th, the critical thinking and media literacy. So I think all of this, a lot of this information is building on kind of getting into that almost like nitty gritty.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, if we don't have any questions, we can go ahead and wrap it up. What do you think, Dr. Bedford?
Let me see. What are your go-to techniques to keep an open mind when a debate may get heated? Okay, this is sometimes it's almost to the point where you have to establish bylaws between yourselves. When you go into, you've tried to resolve things a number of times and it keeps getting heated. So you can actually, this is a piece of advice I give people that ask me this question all the time. And I'll say, agree that if it gets heated, you can get up and you can take a break, but you have to come back. You can't slam any doors. You can't throw things around. You have to force yourself to be quiet and listen. You can even conclude the session for the time being, but you still have to come back. That's the agreement. But each time it should get less difficult. So that's just and people have different strategies. The object that I mentioned works. And while you're holding the object, you can speak. Nobody else can speak. So those are just a couple of strategies, but you have to figure out, especially if this is in your interpersonal interactions, what works best for you, because you know those interactions and what has been taking place. And I can't possibly conceive of every, situation or circumstance. So sometimes it's a matter of collaborating with that other person that you keep getting into these heated interactions with, and developing some kind of a plan, a strategy for moving forward when that happens. Yes, there is a lot to digest. You're welcome.
All right, I feel like we've reached the end. Thank you so much, Dr. Bedford. That was a lot of really great information. And I know I personally look forward to kind of seeing how this builds on the next two presentations. It was great and concise. And again, catch us on March 20th and March 27th, and keep an eye out for the follow-up emails. They're going to be coming from civicclp@carnegielibrary.org. We're going to have some resources from today's program and also a brief survey to help us continue to offer great programs and topics that interest the community. So thank you all again for joining us, and thank you so much, Dr. Bedford, and everyone have a great night.
Thank you for having me.